Thanks everyone. We're already 3 minutes behind schedule, so we'll get underway. My name's Michael, so welcome to the sixth and final of the lightning talks, and indeed the penultimate session for AIMOS2022. We've got 4 presenters today, 2 in person and 2 online, and with 4 to get through in half an hour. And by the time I've stopped speaking, that gives a very strict deadline of 7 minutes per person. So to do something that will work for everyone, I'm going to knock once at 6 minutes and 3 times at 7 minutes, and very shortly after that, if anyone's still going, cut them off. But I understand our first presentation is pre-recorded, so there shouldn't be any problems with that. So we've got Joshua Wang, PhD candidate and STEM educator at Queensland University of Technology. Which, as soon as Beth is...
Yep. Shouldn't be any problem.
And of course, we probably will have very little time at the end, but just in case we all go short, we will save any burning questions for the last minute of this session.
Hello, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a PhD student in Queensland, and I'm here today to discuss with you a small trial I ran of using corpus linguistics to answer a meta-research question. So just to take a step back, in meta-research, particularly in recent years, there's been a few really cool studies looking at the language used in journal articles themselves. And these have been used to answer really cool questions. So for example, this reference here from 2018 looked at how we can automatically recognize whether limitations have been discussed in a journal article to serve, for example, as a screening tool that can be used for journals in peer review. There's also been a study done of just searching for the term hypothesis as a route in to look at how articles are discussing their hypotheses. And then that also ranges all the way to quite complex statistical analyses to look at, for example, how p-values have been reported across a really large data set of journal articles. So these are really fascinating. However, I found it a bit daunting to join into this research myself due to the fact that often the statistics are quite tailor-made for the research project itself, and there's not a lot of guidance out there for that. This is where I think corpus linguistics can come in handy as a tool for meta-research. So corpus linguistics is this small subfield of linguistics that looks at reproducible approaches to handling big text data. And because it's been around for a couple of decades now, there is a fair bit of really easy to use statistical software and streamlined stats for it. And there's a lot of really well-explained textbooks available for the area, so it's quite easy to get into. Despite this, I don't think it's used very much in meta-research from what I've seen anyway. So I wanted to provide an example of how I've tried to incorporate this into answering a meta-research question. So my particular question was inspired by this book, Obesity in the News, and it took a huge corpus of all major UK newspapers for 10 years and looked at how they discussed obesity. So I'm a neuroscientist that researches obesity, and I think it's quite interesting how neuroscientists discuss obesity. So therefore, I designed a corpus of 200 of the highest altmetric scored articles that were based on obesity and published in the Neuroscience Journal in the past 10 years. And to construct that corpus, I had to create an individual Word document of each article, which there's just a video on the right showing you. Nothing fancy, just copying and pasting the sections that I want to keep into that Word document. And the pieces that I decided to keep and lose, it's quite a long list of inclusion and exclusion criteria, but essentially I kept the main text, just not the figures or the tables. And as a result, I ended up with a corpus that has about 1.1 million words in it. So just to show you, once you've got this down, there is some free software called Lanxbox, was the one I chose to use. And it's really simple, and it can provide you with some really interesting analyses that you can customize to your research question. So for example, with me, 2 of the main ways that neuroscientists talk about obesity is it as being an addiction to food or as being in a state of inflammation in the brain. So you can see here, these are 2 examples of co-location, so where we'd find these words and what words we'd find near them. So for example, with neuroinflammation, you can see it's quite close to impairment. These words appear together quite often in the text. So if I wanted to look at, or cognitive, for example, so if I wanted to look at what cognitive meant, I can then look at its concordance lines. So the words that surround cognitive and neuroinflammation. So you can see here, these are each instant of neuroinflammation that I've come across in these articles that I've uploaded, and it's highlighting where cognitive is found. And you can see here for most of these, we're talking about neuroinflammation as being a cognitive impairment, for example. So there's much more complex analysis that can be done with that, but that's just a quick run through. In terms of what I think we can do a bit better in the future, open access is an issue due to copyright concerns. So I have limited this to open access journals only. Hopefully that will improve in the future, depending on widespread publishing trends. It would be nice to have a reference corpus available for research articles, but given how nascent this field is, hopefully that will come in the future so that we can perform comparative analyses. And in addition, I'm not very good at coding, but it would be great to develop some code to streamline this. That's all I have time for, so thank you very much. I'd love to connect with some of you on Twitter if you're available. Meta-research is really interesting to me, and I will make the corpus that I've constructed here available online soon. So stay in touch, and thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
Okay, and now we have another online presentation pre-recorded. We've got Wendy Higgins, who's a PhD candidate in cognitive science with the School of Psychological Sciences at Macquarie University. We'll present on the myth of the well-validated measure. Here we go.
Hello, my name is Wendy Higgins. I'm a PhD candidate at Macquarie University, and today I'd like to talk about measurement validity and the myth of the well-validated measure. While there's been much discussion of the replication crisis in psychology in recent years, concerns have also been raised about potential issues with measurement in psychology. Because social cognition is an important area of research, particularly in clinical populations, I'd like to look at the issues of measurement validity in relation to a widely used measure of social cognition, the reading the mind in the eyes test. This is the AIMOS. Pretty straightforward. Each item has an image of eyes and 4 mental state terms, and the task is to pick the word that best matches what the person in the picture is thinking or feeling. In this case, the answer would be upset. Now, the focus of my talk today is not on whether or not this measure is valid, but on the extent to which studies using the AIMOS include evidence of its validity. To answer this, we conducted a scoping review to identify the studies that use the measure and then see what type of evidence they're providing. We identified over 1,600 studies using the AIMOS, so it is definitely widely used. We also noted a pattern of increasing use over time, and we found evidence that it's perceived to be a valid measure as indicated by its widespread use, and also the 250 studies that explicitly called it valid, validated, or well-validated. All right, so what actual evidence of validity did we find in these papers? These graphs show different types of structural validity evidence, including internal consistency, test-retest reliability, and factor analyses. The red bars represent studies that just didn't mention these types of evidence at all. The green bars represent the studies that calculated that statistic within the current sample, and the blue bars represent studies that cited evidence from previous research. As you can see here, the vast majority of studies just didn't even mention these types of validity at all. Internal consistency was the most frequently reported, in particular Chromebox alpha, and the findings were mixed. Of the 152 studies that reported alpha, approximately 60% of those reported a value that would be below the level commonly taken to indicate acceptable internal consistency, and 40% reporting above that level, so very mixed. You can also see there that there were very, very few exploratory and confirmatory factor analyses. In fact, we only found 2 exploratory factor analyses. We've actually just published one ourselves this year, bringing that up to 3. Our findings were very similar to the previous 2 studies in that we found poor model fit. Many items didn't load onto any factor. The factor loadings were low where they did, and there is no obvious conceptual explanation for the different factors. We also identified 12 studies doing confirmatory factor analyses. These generally looked at either a single factor model or a 3-factor valence-based model. And again, not really strong evidence to support either of those factor structures. So we just don't really know what the factor structure of the armit is. And this is important information. For instance, alpha assumes unidimensionality. So using that as an indicator of internal consistency, you'd want to know that the measure is unidimensional. We also found a lot of studies that used abbreviated versions or split the armit in two to administer the two halves and compare performance. If it's a multidimensional measure, you'd want to know what those factors were to make sure when you're splitting the test that you're equally representing all factors across both halves. So that is important to understand the factor structure. Similarly, when we looked at external validity evidence, so convergent, discriminant, and known group validity, we found that the vast majority of studies just didn't mention these types of validity at all. And where they did, again, the findings were mixed. All right, so what are the implications of this? Is this a problem? Because we can't actually directly observe mental states, it is important to establish that our measures are valid. So ideally, every study would have cited some evidence from previous studies to establish a reasonable expectation that the armit was going to be valid within their current study. And because performance on measures and psychometric properties can vary across different samples, also ideally we would see some sort of evidence calculated within the study to show that the armit was valid within the current sample. Now, obviously, we didn't see that. Is that really a big problem? Well, that's going to depend pragmatically on whether or not the armit is valid. So if the armit's a valid measure, we can say, well, ideally, there would be more evidence presented, but the study's conclusions are still valid, so maybe we can improve, but not a huge deal for the existing literature. However, if the armit's not valid, then this is actually a really big deal because now the conclusions of those studies using it come into question along with the validity of the armit. Okay. Now, I know I said the focus of this talk is not on whether or not the armit is valid, but I do just want to end by saying that I do have some concerns about its validity, which I'll try and very briefly illustrate here by this item from the child armit and a version with the same image from the adult armit. Now, the child version is just supposed to simplify the language to make it more appropriate for use in children. But as you'll see here, the answer to the child armit for this is interested, and the answer in the adult case is uneasy, which are not the same thing. So is he interested or is he uneasy? I'll leave it to you to consider the implications for validity of this, but I'll just say that I do have some concerns about this measure's validity. So if anything I have said has left you feeling interested or uneasy and you'd like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to contact me via email. And I'd like to give a big thanks to my supervisors and collaborators. Thank you.
All right, so I think we've now got back on track with our pre-recorded speakers, and we're ready to go with the PowerPoint for Karim Khan, who's the professor of the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada, and the scientific director of the Canadian Institute of Health Research Institute of Musculoskeletal Health and Arthritis.
Thank you so much, and yeah, mouthful there for the Canadian Institute. And I'll just click forward here, just rotate or click forward. That's good. So thanks very much, and it's a great opportunity to be here. Very much appreciate AIMOS's efforts and the opportunity to be on the program, and thanks for getting me set up. So credit to Paul Blasey, who is a master's student working on this consensus work specifically, and working on a scoping review to go further with this, what I'm going to share with you here. So the reason I put these two slides up, they're examples of consensus. I want to have the process rather than just a consensus statement. So it's a process, and these are difficult, big processes that you see there. And Professor Fiddler referred to other processes today. So it's this area of how do we make decisions and get to agreement or disagreement on things that aren't straightforward, where we don't have perfect data. So that's this field that we're into in Vancouver, and our colleague David Moore in Ottawa, the consensus processes, and this group is familiar with that, so we don't have to labour the why, and there are many more than that. So 2 years ago, Paul Blasey synthesised as part of his preparation work in this field on consensus statements in sport and exercise medicine, rehab, physiotherapy. And that's a lead up to his scoping review that's going to come in February of 2023. So what he's realised in our field is that there wasn't very good purpose. There were these 16 to 30 consensus statements that are prominent in our field, but the scope of those was not always clear. And so these are sort of the 5 hot spots that I'm just going to go through briefly one at a time, but just to make the point that when you're working on consensus processes, have you got the purpose really clear and realistic for the scope? So let's go from there to who's in the room. And historically in our field, there's been a limitation where there's been a bunch of white men and their friends, and then they get together, and it's what we jokingly, but it's not funny, call the barbecue consensus, where they're just getting around the barbecue and they publish that. And John Ioannidis criticised that as saying some of these consensus statements were really long-form editorials. And so that's all I'm going to say about that. So if we're looking to have a better process, we need to get who in the room much more appropriately. And then methods have historically, a lot has just been Delphi, but some of the people running our consensuses haven't done the research and they're not really expert on Delphi. They just throw in like modified Delphi, and modified is their version of that. But looking at Professor Fiedler yesterday in Replicats, you thought about that inclusively, you thought about the method, you thought about how you modified it. So there isn't just one method, there's a bunch of methods that can be used for consensus processes. And then the actual bit about agreement. What is agreement? That's a big area in itself. And the only purpose of the table there isn't for the details, but there are actually 11 elements how you could define consensus agreement in that particular table. So the fourth of these A to D is that the synthesis that you do ahead of time to go, what evidence are we going to use to get to consensus? What's the shared material? That's part D there. So you've got sort of 4 elements that Paul has argued is very important to make sure are in place. That's not all there is. The purpose is really clear. And since he published that, the Accord group had their protocol out. So we reached out to William Gatrell and we worked closely with Patricia Luongo and Amy Van Zuren. And so now Paul Blaze is in this Accord group, and they've done the nice systematic review of the preceding literature. They're working through these processes, including a Delphi, to make a guideline. And so that's sort of the surprise to finish up with. For this group who knows a lot of guidelines and reporting statements and extensions, in this consensus space, I'd argue that there hasn't been a reporting guideline to get consensus on consensus, which has sort of an irony about it as well. So that's all. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Very much, Karim. Powering through it. We might even get time for questions at this rate. So our fourth and final speaker is Austin Mackell, founder of the Stone Transparency, which last year released an open beta of its research transparency platform, which Austin will tell you all about. Take it away, Austin.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for a great, fascinating conference so far. It's great to be included. So the title of my talk is Bibliographies and Research Transparency, or Foundations of what I call Intellectual Taylorism. And we'll come back to that later on. Now, I'm from a company called Stone Transparency. Our slogan is research is valuable, make it visible. Now, we mean that quite literally. So here's our primary target or market has been journalists. So here's a journalist, it's a story on the left. You can see, don't worry, you don't have to read it. And that's a screenshot of a story on a news website called Forensic News. And if our product is this thing halfway through, and you can see here, Scott, the journalist, has said, Forensic News believes in transparency in the journalism process. Go behind the scenes and see how this story was created with the Stone video bibliography. I'm trying to get him to call it a bibliography, but no one's going for that yet. Anyhow, so one of the things you'll notice there is this is 198 minutes. And that's how long Scott spent researching this story, right? So, and you can see that research by clicking the See Research button. That will take you from this, which we call the research portal, to this, which is the research project. Now you see this bar at the top. It has all the key metrics of this research process that we're capturing so far. So there's 198 minutes of research on 5 different occasions. So 5 sessions when he sat down and turned on Stone. There are 20 highlights. That's when he's added his webcam commentaries. And the playback time is 17 minutes. Now, what you see the difference between 198 minutes and 17 minutes is due to the fact that when he doesn't have his webcam on, we're just taking screenshots, 1 per second, right? And we create a time lapse of those sort of longer, boring bits of the research process. But it's still, and you're able to go through and look at individual screenshots to verify a source or check that, you know, the process has been accurately sourced, right? If you'd like, you can see the live version by scanning that QR code. But I think I'll just keep moving along because we're so short on time. And let me put this back over here. Get out of Zoom, right? And so we've been targeting journalists because essentially there's no methodological accountability in journalism. And we think that's a major problem. We thought that video was a way of introducing it that would work well with newsroom pressures. And we were hopeful that many journalists, the better, more good faith journalists, would be keen to opt in since they're all concerned about trust and fake news and they want to distinguish themselves from clickbait and journalism, right? Well, not so much. So I've come to identify with the medical scientist Ignaz Semmelweis, as many of you will obviously know. His insight was that maternity wards where thorough hand washing was practiced had lower rates of infection and death. And this was ignored and rebuffed because a doctor is a gentleman and a gentleman's hands are never dirty, right? And I think basically that's why journalists are ignoring us as well. It's a sense that it would be beneath them to make themselves, you know, vulnerable to the public in this way. So I'm hoping the meta research is more, community is more receptive because there's obvious, if someone's using this, then they can't be hacked. It's that simple. Problem solved. If you make your students or people who are working to, you know, as part of these large collaborative projects use this, then they just can't do it. Or you'd be able to see all the versions that they reject, right? When they're cherry picking their methods and so forth, right? So as I said before, I call this intellectual Taylorism. There's taking the ideas from Frederick Winslow Taylor and the scientific principles of management, and we're just trying to conduct time and motion studies of the mind. So if you're it's not just about catching bad actors, it's about everybody sharing their techniques and getting smarter together and looking at what works and saying, well, wait a minute, this guy got the same result in 5 minutes and it's taking me, you know, 2 hours. I should use those techniques, right? Resistance from journalists, and I expect meta researchers, as it's subjecting the intellectual class to a proletarian level of surveillance. So I explained this to a truck driver in a pub in Outback, New South Wales. Like, yep, I've got a GPS unit in my truck that monitors where I go. Why shouldn't journalists be subject to that as well? Video capture allows for unprecedented levels of accountability, transparency, and reproducibility. And it allows us to derive new metrics as well. So we know that if you've only got 2 metrics, these 2 items look the same. But if you add a third measure, the Z-axis, that you can see that they're actually very, very different, right? And so in media, for example, there's view count, there's the consumption duration, how long it takes to read an article or watch a video, and we're adding in the research duration as another metric which allows you to identify, you know, the true weight of this piece of work, right? And we can also take these metrics and derive further metrics. So consumption duration divided by research duration equals what I call time dilation, right? So Scott's story, he spent 198 minutes reading it. Based on the word count, it should be about 11 minutes to read, 11.5. So that means a time dilation score of 17.2. I just want people to think about that. What percentage of journalists, for example, do you think would be able to achieve that time dilation score? And that's a real measure of the value that you're getting by reading their work. Because if they did 5 minutes of research and it takes you 5 minutes to read the article, you could have just done the research yourself, right? So this is, it immediately eliminates a lot of low effort, low quality content if we can sort of get this out into become an accepted norm. Now, so what? Always the most important question. In the long term, video capture of the research process can be a game changer for meta research and research methodology, and we can build these rich data sets around knowledge deliverables of all kinds. I call it quantitative digital epistemology. I'm considering a master's by research in which I developed this. So if anyone knows of a good supervisor that I should be reaching out to, please let me know. The software exists and you should all just start using it. Currently set up for journalists, but we'd happily collaborate to set up a custom instance for academics and work it around the needs of meta researchers if they were interested. You can download it at writingstone.com. And if you have any questions, here's my contact details.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been the easiest lightning session to share. Everyone's kept his time. In fact, we're left with 2 minutes for questions if anyone's got any questions. And I particularly encourage any questions for our online panelists, given that you'll be able to address any questions to the in-person people here afterwards. So if anyone's got any questions for the online panelists, but otherwise, I see Alex and hand up.
I can switch to an online question. For the reading the mind and the eyes test, a lot of us are quite naive about different ways of establishing validity. So I was wondering about what you can comment about the kind of like the ground truth validity aspect of it, by which which is not a technical term, that probably is the right word, but which I mean the fact that by construction, they took photographs of people, I assume, that really were experiencing those emotions, and so they actually know the right answer.
No. No, the test creators took the pictures from magazines, and they selected the different choices, and then they trialed it with small groups, and yeah, so it's basically based on consensus that at least 50% of people thought that the right answer was the best choice, which has a lot of issues, I think. Sorry, it's a bit hard to hear.
The question was about the difference between reliability and validity within your...
Yeah. So looking at 5-minute talk is a bit tricky. There's a lot of different definitions of validity and different ways to divide up reliability versus validity. I like the concept that reliability is one type of evidence that supports an overall more kind of construct validity idea, where really the main thing is your measure. If your measure can't consistently give similar results, so it's not reliable, it's not really a measure of what you're trying to measure, so it doesn't have construct validity. So I really think of it all in terms of construct validity, and then reliability being one type of evidence in support of construct validity.
I think your questioner is giving some feedback that they do not particularly like that, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up there because we have run out of time. But thank you very much to the audience and the audience. Thank all of the presenters at this lightning.
Thank you.